Justin Cronin is the author of the hugely successful Passage trilogy, which is a post-apocalyptic sci-fi horror series which really does cross genres. That's one of the things that I like about the series, especially the first book, and that genre-crossing quality to his writing is the subject of the first piece of advice I want to read from him. I found out to my relief that you just write how you write. There were not two writers, one the genre guy and one the literary guy. It was just me, working in two shops. It's refreshing to hear this from a traditionally published and really successful author, because usually I find that the advice that gets given when it comes to crossing genre is to avoid it, because you're looking to target your book at a specific audience and market your book to specific types of people, and it does generally, I think, make it more difficult to get published if you jump between genres. I've queried several books to literary agents since I began writing, and a lot of the time my own writing tends to span across several genres. It tends to be like crime or sci-fi with a hint of literary fiction to it, and that makes it really difficult to place. As I've said tons of times, I've had agents come back to me and say, we like the writing, but we just don't know what to do with it because nobody takes this kind of thing. So in that way, it's nice for someone to acknowledge that it can happen. No matter how rare or how unlikely it might be, you can get this stuff published. And if that's the kind of story that's coming from you and that's the story that you want to write, absolutely carry on writing it. That's what I'm doing. I know that by the time I finish my book, there might be little demand for it, but I don't really care that much. I just want to write the story that I want to write. It's just nice to have that acknowledged by an author who's done it. So if you're like me and you're writing a cross-genre kind of book, then just keep going, because you never know where it could end up. I believe that creativity requires a form of auto-hypnosis in order to work. You need to put your mind in a state where the unconscious mind, where all the interesting connections are made, where metaphors are built. You have to be able to lift that dream state closer to your waking state. Otherwise, the book's just building an engine, not creating something interesting. This says a lot about writing routine, I think. And one huge mistake I've made in my writing routine is to focus solely on that word of writing and not focus too much on thinking. You might know from my previous videos, I don't plot out my entire books all the way through. So I don't spend that time up front figuring out how everything's going to work. I figure it out as I go. And then, of course, the tendency is that I'll just write and keep writing, and as long as words keep coming to me, I'll just write them down, and I won't think too much about all of the stuff that needs to go into it. But if you do take some time and really think about your story and get into that auto-hypnosis dream state where you're just considering all aspects of the story that you're telling, it can definitely help you figure out where you need to take it. In the interview this is taken from, he's actually talking about running. That's his auto-hypnosis dream state. That's where he can sort of shut everything off and just run and think about his story. And then when he gets back, he writes it all. That's similar in approach, I think, to Haruki Murakami. Whether you plot or you don't plot, I would really recommend finding a way to do this. For me, personally, it's before I go to bed every night. When I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about my story, and you'd be surprised, just without any other distractions on your mind, how much you can actually think of and how many answers to questions just come to you. But it doesn't have to be even that big of a thing. It doesn't have to be part of your daily routine. It can be while you're writing. Just stop for a while. If you come to a halt or a bump in the road, just stop for a few minutes. Sometimes I like to just close my eyes and lean back in my chair for a while, and answers will generally come to me when I do that. Well, not answers necessarily, because I'm not talking about puzzles all the time, but just sometimes an idea of something will come to me that wouldn't have if I just kept rolling on. I especially like the end of this tip where he's talking about without all that stuff, you're just building an engine, you're not creating something interesting. That's definitely happened in my previous books. I've just been writing and writing and writing on and on like a locomotive. There's no thought to it whatsoever. I'm just shoving fuel in and off I go all the way to the end of the book. And it really shows on those times. I finish the book, read the finished article back, and I can tell there's no soul to it because I haven't stopped to think long enough to take the story where it needs to be as opposed to just where it can be. So I'd say definitely take note of this one and think about your story, spend some time with an empty mind, and it really can affect your story in ways that you wouldn't expect. I always end my books badly. My books are about 1100 pages long in manuscript. I find the first half great, and then in the second half something goes wrong. I end up in the wrong spot, or it's just underwhelming, so I have to go back and rewrite the second half of the book. I can immediately relate to this because I often find the second halves of my books underwhelming too, and I think it's because of that last tip as well. Because once I've got into the rhythm of writing and I'm putting down chapter after chapter, I've stopped thinking. that's when things become underwhelming, because things just happen, because, I don't know, I've got to get to the next plot point somehow, so yeah, that will do. When you get to the that will do stage of your writing, you're going in the wrong direction, or at least you need to stop and think about it a bit more. Unlike Justin Cronin, I am not capable of going back through the latter half of my finished book and writing it again. I don't have the patience for it. By the time I get to the end, I feel like I've gone so far off course in these books where it's happened that it's not recoverable, so I just don't. That's definitely a skill that I need to learn and try and put some time and energy into, because it's worth remembering all the enthusiasm that you have about your story at the start of the book is valid and it makes sense and it applies to what could be an entire book. It's not like you just really love the first half and you know the second half you're not bothered about. You love the entire story that you've thought up, and that will carry through if you let it, if you don't rush through and just try to continue it and finish it as quick as possible. There's no doubt about it, the second half of a book is harder than the first half because you don't have necessarily all of that enthusiasm and all of that energy to keep writing it, because it's hard. It's difficult to sit down day after day and just chip away at something while also concentrating on everything about it that you love and that makes it great, because it can feel like work a lot of the time. So you need to stop every now and again and remind yourself what you're trying to do with the book, what excited you about it in the first place, because that will bleed through the pages to your reader. Aside from that, the first half of any book is pure creation. You're opening all these plot lines and you're creating these threads. The second half, you're trying to pull all of those together and make them go where you want to. The second half is always going to be harder. The first half is wide open. The second half, not so much. But when you think about it, it's the second half really that's more important. By the time you get to that second half, your reader is invested in your characters, they're invested in your story, they want to see it come to a satisfying conclusion, and that's really hard to do. I definitely need to learn this. I need to get better at going back and assessing what needs to change and not just thinking, oh, forget it, I can't be bothered now. That's a big failing on my part. And with this book that I'm writing now, I'm really hoping that I'm not going to have to do that. I'm nearing the middle of it now and I still feel the same kind of energy as I did when I started. So hopefully it'll carry through a bit longer before I run out of steam, but I will run out of steam eventually. When I do, just need to be patient with myself. Think about it, like I said. Hopefully that'll mean I have less to do when I get to the end of it, but it's always going to be work. My motto's always been, write the book that wants to be written. The passage wanted to be written. I think you can really tell from how the story crosses genres. It's not that he wanted to do that or he wanted his book to fit into several of these categories. It's just where the story needed to go. It just happens to have elements of sci-fi and happens to have elements of horror. It's just the way it was leading him. I've written books before that I amended to fit into a certain genre and that I changed my direction of when I realised I was crossing over, and they always ended up not great. And they always ended up a little bit soulless and boring and underwhelming, as he said before. But the stuff that I've written without any regard for that, the stuff that I've written just because I was excited by the idea and I wanted to follow it through, those are always the better stories for me. I don't think that any amount of research or determination to make your book fit somewhere can ever replace the energy or the organic energy you get from being interested in your story and being inspired to write it. I just don't think you can write a story that's as good if you're intentionally aiming it somewhere. I think you just have to let it play out in front of you. I certainly do anyway. Maybe I'm just speaking for every writer when really I should be speaking just for myself. Whatever the case, I think if you feel that push to tell your story, you're on the right track. Follow that. Don't follow where you think it should be. Don't follow all the questions that pop up to you as you're writing. Just follow what feels right to you and what feels exciting to write. And it probably will be to a reader as well. Half the human race is women. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't take their points of view and use whatever powers I possess as a writer to imagine their experience. Without a doubt, there is a huge problem across literature and film and everything about the portrayal of women characters by male authors. Too often I'll DNF a book or my wife will show me a paragraph of just embarrassing writing where a man has just described a woman by her physical appearance for no apparent reason that doesn't add anything to the story, and it's clear that that character has been written as an amusement or an object for the male characters in the book. It happens depressingly often. If you're on the right side of social media, you'll see posts all the time of usually women reading out paragraphs of just awful writing by men that just completely objectifies women for no other reason than just their own amusement or the amusement of, I assume, a male readership. I think a really solid idea is to think about how and why you're describing your women characters. For example, if you feel no great urge to describe the anatomy of your male characters, why do you feel it's necessary to describe those of your female characters? Is it to add to your plot, or is it required for your reader to understand what's happening in your book? If not, something to strongly consider. And as he says, he wouldn't be doing his job if he didn't try to understand or imagine the experience of women in his books, and we all have a duty to do that. That's the approach I take with all of my characters. Everyone is a person, everyone has their individual personalities, motivations, history, things they want, things they hate, places they're trying to get to. Every character, regardless of any demographics across the entire spectrum of gender, they all have those things that can be applied to them. That's how you describe them, from their characteristics, what they want, what they need. Everyone is a person, everyone has humanity, and that's the place that you need to write your characters from, not their bust size. That's only one side of it even, because there's still a huge problem of how do you write strong women characters, because a lot of writers seem to think that it's by applying typically male characteristics to a female character that makes her strong. So make her argumentative and angry and tough and muscular. That makes a strong woman character. It doesn't. It's not about that. Strength in characters, I think, comes in many different forms. I think a character that lacks emotion and is just tough isn't necessarily strong, and a vulnerable character who is very emotional is not weak. You have to think about your characters and think about what made them that way. What are they up against? What are they coming from? All of that stuff contributes to how strong they are or how weak they might be. You can show strength in characters in many different ways, and you can show weakness in just as many ways. There's an almost unlimited amount of personalities and character traits to be had in the world. You can make your characters into whatever you want them to be, but the more stereotypical you make them, the less interested people are going to be in them. And the people that you're trying to describe with these characters, be that women or female presenting people, they're not going to be impressed with the same old stereotypes and the same old characteristics that don't represent them and don't represent reality. So this is a great point, and one I'm really glad to see, because I think male authors especially still have a lot of work to do when it comes to how they depict women in their stories. I'm not saying I get it right 100% of the time. I don't. Everyone makes mistakes. We're all just trying to learn how to get better. But I think if your intent is to get things right and to accurately portray women on the page, then great. That's all you can do. Just keep learning and educating yourself, and you'll write better stories for it. And if your response to this tip is disregard or disinterest, or you're rolling your eyes, then I just want to let you know, this isn't going to change here. And I may only have a small platform, but I'm going to try and use it to promote equality however I can. Like Justin Cronin says, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't. A story needs to demonstrate from the get-go a thorough knowledge of itself. The reader should feel like they're in the presence of an authoritative storyteller. They'll sense that. This is a very interesting one, and a slightly frightening one for someone that doesn't plot their entire stories throughout. But I think there's more to knowing your story and knowing where it's going than simply the plot points. I always have an idea of where my story is eventually going to go, what the ending that I want, but I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about knowing your story, as in the themes that it's getting across, the point of it, the heart of the story. That's really what I'm getting at. And I think you can know all of that through and through without knowing all of the twists and turns of your plot or your narrative. I have a bit of a strange analogy for it. For me, it feels like carrying a venomous tarantula in a glass box. While it's contained within the box, it can't run off in all of these different directions as it's trying to. I know where I'm taking it. I know what the end goal is, and I know that it's contained within this glass box. So all of the time when it's running from left to right or up the walls and sticking to the ceiling, I don't know where it's going to be at any one particular moment, but I know that it's bound within the confines of this box. So that's how I look at my story. I might not know all of the twists and turns that are going on within the box, but I know ultimately where I'm taking the entire thing. And I really do think, as he says, that readers can feel that. They can feel that they're in the presence of an authoritative storyteller. When you know your story, you know the bones of it, then I think that really does shine through onto the page. And you don't get those moments like you sometimes get. I'm sure you've read those moments where you're like, I feel like they don't know where they're going with this story. That can very much happen, but if you know the story and you're faithful to it and you follow it where you really feel like it should go, you can avoid that. But what if your tarantula is loose, but you know exactly what route it's going to take? What if you've planned out your entire story? You know every twist and turn, you know every move this tarantula is going to make to try and escape, and you've thought about it ahead of time. As long as you end up where you need to go with it, you can just watch it make its way there. That works perfectly well. But I think a combination of the two is where the most security is. I think having it in that box and knowing where it's going, that's the ideal position to be in, really. That's total control over your story. There's no doubt that'll be detectable right by the reader. They'll feel like they're in very good hands as they go through the story. Either way, you need to have at least one. You need to have the box, or you need to know exactly where the spider is going to be at all times. The more I talk about this, the less it seems like it makes sense, but hopefully this translates. Whatever the case, the safest thing to do is have a good bearing on both if you possibly can. That way you're bound to steer your story exactly where you want it, and your readers are going to feel that. Those are some really great, valuable tips, and if you've never read The Passage, I would definitely recommend it. As always, thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.